As a deer pants for flowing streams, so pants my soul for you, O God. My soul thirsts for God, for the living God. When shall I come and appear before my God? Pastor Ken gave us an encouragement from Psalm 42 a couple weeks ago, and I want to encourage you to go back and listen to that because it's very good. This morning, I just want to focus on that question, because 9 weeks in and not meeting together as a church, many of us are asking that question. When shall I come and appear before God? Because he's not just talking about his morning devotions. In the context, he's talking about public worship. Listen to how he goes on. My tears have been my food day and night, while they say to me all day long, where is your God? These things I remember, how I would go with the throng. The throng is the people, the gathering, the assembly, and lead them in procession to the house of God with glad shouts and songs of praise. Glad shouts and songs of praise. It's hard to do that in your living room by yourself or with your family. I can't tell you how hard it is for Pastor Ken to come in week and week out and preach to an empty sanctuary. He shouts when he preaches, and you can hear him even now. And when I say that, as he animates himself and as he's preaching, and the laughter of the congregation as there's that give and that take. Or the songs of praise. I can't tell you how hard it is for Ellen to come in and play, and there are no voices to go along with her accompaniment. And I can't tell you how many times the staff has gotten together on a Monday on Zoom, and tears have been shed as we talk about how we long for our people to come back together in the building so that we can sing together. I'm not saying that as a pity party, because I know many of you, I just talked to somebody this morning who said that she watches the service alone, and week by week it gets more difficult and more difficult, and the tears flow more readily as she misses the congregation and being together. It goes on, how I would go with the throng and lead them in the procession, a multitude keeping festival. He's describing public worship. And so when he says, when will I appear before God, he's not talking about just in his morning devotions, or I'm not trying to internalize it and say that we can always do that. What he's talking about is being together with the people of God, worshiping God corporately. And there's a grief that happens. And there's a real grief. And honestly, that's a good sign. If you're grieving because you're not able to be together with the congregation, maybe you can rejoice in that. Paul talks about a people who are suffering but always rejoicing, because we can identify with the psalmist that he misses worshiping God together with the people of God. If you didn't grieve, if you're one of those who, I might not ever go back to church. This is great. I've got my Sunday mornings, or I'll just flip it on. If that's your heart and there is no grief and you can't identify with this, I would just ask you to test yourself. Why? Why am I not grieving? To be together with the people of God, worshiping God corporately together. The psalmist goes on and he says, why are you cast down, O my soul? And Pastor Ken talks a lot about that. And in one version it says, why are you depressed? And why are you in turmoil within me? Hope in God, for I shall again praise him, my salvation and my God. My soul is cast down within me. My soul is depressed, the version says. When we talk about grief, a lot of times we apply it to when people die, but there's all kinds of grief that we go through. And I'm not a psychologist, and I'm not trying to be one right here, But the stages of grief that counselors will talk about, we experience those in the grieving process. And I just want to go through these and see if you can identify that. The first one is shock. Do you remember the first time you went to a place and it was empty? Or the first time you saw somebody with a mask and it hit you and it was a little bit jarring? Denial. The idea that this isn't really as bad as they say it is. No, it's just, we're just going to be back in a week. We'll be back in 2 weeks. We'll be back in 4 weeks. Negotiating. That's another, trying to make deals with God, or trying to work the situation to our benefit. Anger. Just being mad and angry. Why do they not let us go together? And it can turn towards the government, towards the media. It can turn towards our brothers and our sisters. And I refer you to Pastor Stephen's encouragement from yesterday, that it's good when we dwell together in unity. And just let me say as a side note, we need to understand that there are people in the church who are going through all of these different stages. And all of us, none of us are whole people. We're all broken people. And I want to encourage us, I want to encourage you that if you don't think you're grieving, you don't think that you're angry, or you think that you're justified, just to consider the fact that maybe you're in denial. And ask the Lord to do a work in you and in our congregation. Okay, end parenthesis. Another stage of grieving is depression. And I know that people are dealing with that sadness of being alone and isolated. Pray for those. If you're not one of those people who are alone and isolated, there are many people in our church, singles, widows, widowers, who are alone and they're isolated in these times. And then finally, acceptance or resolution, as we come to grips with the reality. One of the things that I've been coming to grips with is that God is dealing with the idols of my heart, just like in Egypt when he judged this. There's the plagues. Each one of those plagues, they weren't random. They were directed at the gods of Egypt, the god of the Nile, the god of the sun. They worshipped the frogs, the cattle, and finally the firstborn son of Pharaoh himself. These were directed at the gods. And when I look at the gods of my heart and of our culture, I see the gods of sports, of entertainment, of food, of financial security. And I can't help but think that maybe God is dealing with the idols of our culture, of our hearts, of my heart. Maybe there's an idolatry associated with ministry, with worship, with corporate worship, that God is dealing with us as he says, come to me, all you who are weary and heavy laden, because the church is not a service. And we know this. We know that the church isn't, and that worship isn't something we do 1 hour a week. But in our minds, a lot of times, I think that we've narrowed down church to a service, and then we go off and live. First Baptist Church, what I'm asking and encouraging you to do is to not, during these times of isolation, not to find your hope in the assembly of the people. It's a good thing to assemble and worship God together. But while we're not able to meet together, to not miss the work that God is doing in the church scattered across the seacoast, and to be the church together in isolation, dwelling together in unity, bearing with one another, whether you have a strict social distancing guidelines or not strict social distancing guidelines. And when we come back together, whether it's to your liking or not to your liking, that we would not be focused on those things, but rather that we would hope in God. It's our prayer as pastors that this would be true for all of us. And I know that it's our heart's desire as individuals and as people that our hope would be in God. The last comment I'll make is that the psalmist is speaking to his own heart. And we talk to ourselves, and there are voices that we listen to. And I want to encourage you, as I sign off, to listen to the voice of God, not to the megaphones of the media or Facebook, or even to the downward spirals in your own mind that might lead you to despair. That we'd be a people who is always rejoicing, even if we are rejoicing simply in the fact that we're able to grieve because we're not able to be together.